Hello there and welcome back. It's been a while since I've recorded one of these, as always. Today I'm going to be showing off a uh, session of me working on something in Omegaspace. And don't worry, the screen isn't frozen. I just am doing something silly. So I actually pre-edited all this footage I compiled together while I was working, and now I'm just going to talk over it while I play it. I feel like it's probably easier for me to just pause it and then fast forward instead of, record my voice and overlay it afterwards. But I can always undo that. Anyway, so I'm working on displaying full life-size real planets in the game. So if I hit play, they use billboards, by the way. I first got the billboard system working again. The old recode and the older versions of the game actually worked. Here it is after I made some tweaks that actually make it, move with the camera's location and everything. But the problem is that it's in shadow, which is not good. So here's another test of me trying to write some code and seeing if it's going to work, and it doesn't do anything. And I'll actually show the code in a second, but first what I'm going to be doing, it's kind of hard to see, by the way. I apologize. I have an ultra wide, so recording on this is a little finicky. I will get the quality and aspect ratio down in the future. So I'm selecting between the camera's position inside the viewport frame and the position of the actual planet. And we can see that they're the exact same. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up here and I'm going to add a new component to the entity component system called offset. Basically what was happening was I was sending the location and the position of the planet to the client by sending the zone location. And the way zones work, and I'm not going to ramble about this because I've already made plenty of videos on it, is they essentially are areas of space that load in separately. And so if you think about EVE Online, right, you can, or even Starscape, you can jump to a planet and there's an area of space in front of that planet. That's what a zone is, right? Except we can have other zones in the middle of nowhere or multiple zones around a planet. But every planet has at least one zone. And so I was stupid in using the main zone of every planet to synchronize the location of the planet with the player, which doesn't work. So what I'm doing is I'm adding an offset, which lets me specify how far away from the planet center the zone is. So I'm just going through some of the typings right now for my configuration files and adding that stuff in. I'm currently using TOML for the files, which is kind of like YAML, but better. Here I am tripping balls a little bit, remembering I have to use number because TOML can't support Roblox data types. So we just have to use basic primitives. So here I am going to the configuration file, and I don't know what just got pasted there, but the GitHub Copilot really likes to do stuff that are finicky. So here I am typing in a manual position for Demeter Station, which is the testing area. I'm not going to be using TOML files, I don't think, for everything. I think probably what I'll do is add, like, it's going to be using data stores, and maybe I'll have my own server that sends stuff via HTTPS to Roblox. I don't know. Now I'm just going to be adding another component because I made a mistake when I was doing this, so I have to create a separate planet component. Now I'm going to set the planet's, the entity ID of the planet. We're going to give it the component planet. We're also going to the zone. We create an entity for the zone, and we're going to be specifying its offset, which is what we got to do. So now I'm going to the function where I create zones that are not parented towards planets. And I'm just copying and pasting this between there, making sure everything is where it needs to be at. Then I go up top here and I'm going to realize, okay, we got to set the default position. So basically, another issue I had was I realized there's freestanding locations, and these are things like, you can have a space station not orbiting a planet in the middle of nowhere. I might put up a visual for that in a second. Or what you can do is you can just have like a wormhole or something, right? And these just have a position, not a offset, because they're not offset from anything. They're only offset from a star. So we just use position. So we're just defining this once instead of using it twice for its position and its offset. You can see that's what I was doing down here. By the way, this is TypeScript. You can use TypeScript in Roblox now. It has a separate compiler. Like, this is a developer-led thing, but I really like it, and I'm using an entity component system called ECR plus some of my own stuff on top of this. And ECSs are like, it's like if you have OOP, but you separate the data from the functionality. So it's actually completely different from OOP. Now what I'm doing is I'm going into the function where I broadcast the C frames of the zones to the client. Again, I was incorrectly sending the locations of the planets by telling it the locations of the main areas outside the planet you can fly in to the client. So I'm making a new loop where I'm going to scan for all of the components in the zone, or excuse me, all of the entities in my array that have the body zone component, which means that it is a zone that is orbiting a planet. And I realized I made a mistake, and I switched that to the ellipse instance. So the ellipse instance is basically something that comes back to the old demo I made. And with ellipses, you can basically, or at least with what I made, is I have to simulate orbiting, right? Except you don't want to actually simulate gravity in Roblox, or even anything really, because you can have physics precision degrade over time. It's really bad. So basically, I just take some parameters like the distance from the star, its eccentricity, which is essentially how, like, much of an oval it is, kind of, its inclination, the tilt, and all that stuff. And basically, what I do is I convert that into a oval that can be iterated on. So I can just say, okay, the starting position is this, and we're going to just basically do ellipse dot step every frame, and it'll figure out it'll track the planet's position. Anyway, so that only exists on the server right now. What I'm doing is I'm basically just grabbing the C frame from that. It'll compute the C frame, and we're going to put that in a list and send the list to the client. We're also setting the position of one of the entities to that. This is all probably a little complicated to follow, which is understandable because I haven't really shown this off or how the code works to people, which is fine. But what I do want to add is, even if you were me and understood the code base, what I'm doing here is a little bit of a clusterfuck. So, but we can always go back and make it better, because at this point I'm on the third recode in the last, 2 years, and we just need to get this out. Next, I'm scanning again for the zones that are not orbiting a planet. These are just, again, freestanding zones. We don't really have to do anything here outside collect its position, because its position is usually constant. There's no things that really adjust. And actually, excuse me, we are scanning for zones that are essentially, the top loop takes all the ellipse instances, which compute the planet's position based on orbital data, and it will synchronize that data with the components for the planet's C-frame. The bottom loop here that I'm writing will take all of the zones, which are parented to a planet or not, and it will update them. It doesn't need to do anything if it's not parented to a planet, and it's just freestanding because of the fact that the location will pretty much never change. So next, I'm just going to the events functions, the event definitions, and I'm not typing that fast, by the way. This is all edited. Adding some new events, and I'm going to connect to that, receive planet C frames, and we're going to go back and check some stuff here. Network config. So the network stuff is a little funny, actually. So none of the events are actually physically created until runtime due to reasons I'll explain later. But basically, I have to init them because they only exist in the typing system, and they only become created once you index them. So the server has to index them before the client does. Next, what I'm doing is I'm adding to these loops to compute the zone positions on the client, and the server, and I'm making sure that we query for the zone entity here, which will store all the data about the zone. Or not all the data, but just like the core data about what it is. So basically its ID. Next over here, I'm going to check the planet list, and I'm going to set the planet list. Then I'm going down to broadcast the planet locations, or excuse me, the C frames. So then I go to the client, and I'm going to make a new entity called planet entity, which will basically scan for, or excuse me, what we'll do is, this is actually a mistake that I made, and I'll get into that in a second. But what I'm doing is I'm setting components.zone to a planet entity when there's already a component, there's already entities that have the zone component to store what zones exist, that the client is at least able to see. And so this causes some issues, and you'll see it in a second when I hit play. I get really, really confused. So we're doing that for the planet and then for the moon. And I'm using some nice keyboard shortcuts to abuse, or not abuse, but just use the nice little keyboard candy that VS Code has to edit multiple things at once. Then I'm just creating a note. So yeah, this is creating a dedicated planet entity. Sometimes I got to write stuff down so I don't forget later, I think I was also documenting it for when I was doing this voiceover, but now we're going to print it just for debugging, because I have a feeling something's going to go wrong. Spoiler alert, I'm right. We're going to print the ID of the body. So I hit play, and we're just going to search in the output, and I'll move it over in a second again. Here's the debugger for the ECS. It's pretty fun. So I'm checking, and the planets are moving, but it's not displaying what it's supposed to. So I'm like, okay, crap. So we go into receive planet C-frames. So we go back and we make sure to actually store the C-frames that we're receiving and to update our world state for the client. So we're querying and we're going to say we're going to find components.zone where the zone equals the zone ID. And really quick, what's essentially happening with this is that the ECS system will automatically generate an ID for every entity. The problem is that this does not synchronize between the client and the server, and it would be stupid to do so. So now we're going to go back and we're going to go make sure that we're synchronizing the C-frames that we're receiving from the server. So the ECS system actually has its own IDs for every entity, which is basically a little thing that stores data. You can put components on it. The problem is that we also have to store separate IDs from the entity component system for the zone IDs and for ship IDs, because the entity IDs are different between every registry. So if the server actually has a bunch of different registries, so there's no way to synchronize it with the client. So we basically just have a little designation for the zone ID. So we're checking for what entity has the component zone that equals the zone ID. We're going to just add a little check statement here because in theory, this should always exist, but you never want to trust replication because something could be off and you could ruin everything. If it tries to do something to a zone that doesn't exist, you're screwed, right? So then once we find it, we're going to set the C-frame component of that entity to the C-frame that we've received. Then I'm like, wait, hang on. This is setting the same thing as the zone position. And at this point, I started to realize I was making a mistake. So now I have to go undo some stuff. So I go back here. I created a new component. I think I called it planet zone ID. Yep. And then we have to delete the zone. We're going to do that in a second. There we go. So I deleted that because essentially the issue with this was we were creating the zone component really is supposed to only exist just to store on entities that are copying the zone from a server. So it basically says, okay, here are the zones that you are allowed to see, client, just to know they exist. Basically areas in space you can jump to. The problem with what I was doing though is not only was I creating not only was I replicating the zone information to the client, but I was using the component for the zone inappropriately to store that a entity had something to do with the planet zone. It's I don't remember what I was doing. I was feeling pretty brain dead. But anyway, so I'm just making some tweaks to the code now. I'm scrolling up and down because I'm starting to lose my mind. I'm like, where was I at? I'm not going to edit this out because I think it was a little funny to see what I was doing here. As you can see, I'm just messing around with stuff. So instead of querying for the zone, I fixed that. I have to query for the planet zone ID now. Basically what's happening is instead of using the zone... So okay, the reason we were using the zone component is because the zone component is a string and the zone IDs in the game are also strings. And so the mistake I was making was taking something that was meant to designate that an entity was a zone and using it to specify that the zone that this entity was linked to had that ID. And so I had to create a separate component called planet zone ID instead. Little silly of me, but I was, and then actually I edited the wrong thing. I was editing zone positions. I needed to edit receive planet C-frames. And also at some point I changed it so that for zone positions, we're only going to be replicating the vector 3 because planets need a C-frame because they also have rotation. Zones don't because they are just a position in space. And a little fun fact, we actually store the position in gigameters, which convert at a scale of 149 gigameters about to an astronomical unit, which in real life is the distance between the Earth and the Sun on average, but it's a pretty standard measurement or unit of measurement. So I hit play, nothing worked. Of course. Also, it's going to be a little washed out because of the HDR, which I'll disable in the future. I'll pull this up in a second. I'm just checking the camera position and the planet position. And what you're about to see is that there's a pretty big issue, which is that it's not actually setting the planet's position. So what I have to do is I go back to the camera update, which is for the billboard system. We're going to get the C-frame component for the zone. And I'm like, wait a second, this isn't working. I just had to typecast it as it definitely exists. So then what we're going to do is, this is kind of a hack. We're not really supposed to do it this way. I end up changing the way it's being done, but we're just going to find all the models inside the viewport frame in the billboard and just set them to the C-frame. If the C-frame doesn't exist, we're just going to set it to 010. The reason we don't want it at 000 is because the math that it's going to do is going to result in it having nan. which is not a number and can corrupt your numbers really easily. So now I'm like, okay, it's not working. What's going on? So I'm going to check the C frame, and you're going to see that I'll pull it up right here in a second. So you're going to see that I pulled this up here. So I'm a little confused, so I'm just going to print out the board ID, and we're going to see what happens. The thing with this type of stuff is that it's all in billboards, right? So it's very hard to visualize and test this. There are ways to test it that are different, not as problematic. I don't quite remember what the issue was here, but there was something that was not working right in the entity component system. I tried searching the debugger for it, and Roblox actually crashed because there's some type of error in the loop. So I used the old debugger, and it also doesn't work. So I'm a little confused here. I'm like, what's the issue? The nice thing about the entity component system is you can use good debuggers. The problem is that sometimes the debuggers don't work. But after tweaking a little typo I had, you can see that it appears now in the background, which is great. So it's working again. You can see its position being changed in real time, so it is moving slowly with the orbit data. So this is good. Now I basically just have to get the lighting to work. So what I'm doing now is I added a sun rays to just temporarily try and figure out where the sun is coming from, because I'm a little silly and was having trouble figuring that out just by looking on the light direction. So the viewport frame is supposed to set the light direction based on its relation to the sun. And you can see that it's corrupted, it's nan. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to try and pause the entire entity component system loop so I can edit it. But the problem is it's not going to work because I'm using a something outside of what I'm supposed to. I was using a hack. So we'll go into the update function for the board system, and I'm just going to print the current zone location to see what the issue is, because I feel like this is probably the issue, because as you can see here, the way it's getting the light position is it's using the zone position. So we go back, and it's 0, which is great. And I was like slamming my head on my keyboard at this point because I was like, what's going on? And then I realized, wait a second, because I had to change how I was setting the planet position to not use zone locations, I have to go back and I actually have to undo what I did. So I realized I was in the wrong system, so I have to go back over to the replication system for the client. And now I'm basically just tweaking that so that I can actually get it to work. The issue, if I rewind a second here, was that I was querying for the C-frame component, but because I changed it to use vector 3s for data efficiency, because we didn't need the rotation part of the C-frame, I forgot to change. I was silly and I forgot to go back and change the fact that it was using the C-frame to use a position component. So that's what I did. And then I'm just going to mess around with multiplication here because it's not actually so real quick. It's real life scaled, right? So if one stud is about a meter in game, it's not. I can't remember what it's actually set to. The sun is like 1,000,000 meters away, right? Actually, it's 149 billion meters away. That's what it is. The issue is that there's no way to use numbers that big without floating point errors, right? Because the way that numbers work in Roblox and also a lot of game engines is that like there's a certain precision limit, because otherwise it takes up too much data to store that big and precise of a number. So instead I basically just stored in megameters or astronomical units, so it's only a couple digits long. But the byproduct of this is that there's some math issues where I have to multiply it just to bring it back up to what it's supposed to be. I'm using some weird tricks with the viewport frame system and the billboard system. See, I tried to pause it, but it's still going to be moving because I'm using some hacks that I shouldn't be using. This is me just making some semantic changes. But then I'm going to add a big position to it, and I'm just going to see what happens. So the reason we can't see the planet is the virtual position of the fake camera that's pretending to be really far away is inside the planet right now. And I have to fix that. So what I try doing is messing with the scale of the planet to see if that works, but it's in the center of the planet. So, you know, even if it's 0.001, the camera's still in the center of it. So I deleted everything in the workspace. I'm really desperately trying to figure out what's going on. I'm like, something's going on. So eventually what I did was I copied the data, I copied the billboard from the running game and pasted it in Studio separately to verify that it actually exists. And I'm going to play that again. So it's all a very complex, funny system, but Yeah, so you can see that I'm eventually going back and I'm verifying that the object actually exists in some area of space just to make sure I'm not, tweaking too hard, right? And it is. So now we're going back in game. I don't think I made any changes. I was just checking stuff. So now I'm going to set it to a bigger number, 20, 20, 20. And spoiler alert, this works. So let's go back and hit play, and boom, there it is. So once again, the issue was that the client had a mismatch between the actual location of the zone outside the planet, the area you jump into, and what the server was computing. So I fixed that in a minute. Obviously, there's an ugly seam there. I'm going to get around to fixing that. Roblox limits texture resolution to 1024 by 1024 currently. And that's really annoying because when you have something that's massive, you need like a 4K or an 8K texture, which means that in order to do that, I have to split this up into smaller meshes to fit multiple textures on. So I'll get that fixed later. I also got to add rim glow and stuff, which I did in the past. But what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to go in and disable all the other planets because they're all in the same location right now, just so I can mess around with this one. And that's what I'm doing. I'm just messing around with its contrast kind of, and I'm like, wait a second, why is it like not fully black? And then I realize it's because I have the atmosphere. So there's a little annoying side effect is I can't really use the atmosphere that much, because if I do, it will affect the viewport frame, or excuse me, the billboard. There's some ways around this, but unless you're in an area that's like dusty and has an atmosphere, you don't want to have the atmosphere for this purpose. But it does add a nice effect to make things that are further away, even if it's not hazy, appear a little more blended in with the skybox. So it's unfortunate, but I'll find a workaround at some point, I think. But anyway, yeah, so that worked. Next, what we got to do is we got to adjust the be better. So I'm basically just going to multiply it by the global distance mod, which I think is 149, because again, we're converting from gigameters to astronomical units. And it broke again. And I think around this point is when I realized, hold on a second, something's fishy. So I made another tweak because I broke something on the server. I didn't record that, but now it works. So I just have to go in and I have to adjust the scale of everything because it's not like quite what it should be. The problem is that now the lighting is broken, and so I have to go in and fix that. And I eventually do get it working, but I'll make another video about that, I think, because this is pretty long at this point. I think I've been rambling for about 25 minutes now. There's certainly more interesting ways to make devlogs, but I hope you guys enjoyed this. I just wanted to record a session of me doing work. In the past, I've done Discord streams. The problem is I just tend to yap and talk to you guys about my ideas with the game when I do that instead of actually getting work done. So, yeah, and then I adjusted the scale. It's not perfect. There's some contrast and coloring issues. I got to fix them. HDR is all weird, but it works. So we have the big planets rendering finally. And I can get to work on some other really cool stuff. So yes, the game is still in the works. We're going to have a lot of fun with this. And yeah, hope you guys enjoyed. And I will see you guys in the next video. My goal is to get a playable combat demo out within the next couple months. Thanks for watching.